Well, greetings and welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset. Today we are going to speak with Lauren Foote. Lauren is a lifelong disability rights advocate, and I think that's going to be interesting and relevant to talk about. She's been very involved in urban planning and a bunch of stuff, technical term there, up in Canada. Lauren, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I'm so excited to be a part of your podcast.
Well, we're glad to have you. Why don't we start by you telling me a little bit just about you growing up, how things started, and just a little about you as a younger Lauren.
Sure. So I'm from Tawasin. It's a small suburb outside of Vancouver, Canada. My father's tetraplegic. I have a mental health disability, and I have other close family members with disabilities as well. So disability justice has always been a large part of my life, and I've always been active in the disability advocacy community, even from a young age, like you were saying. So
when you say a tetraplegic, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so it's paralyzed from the neck down. So people might be familiar with paraplegic,
quadriplegic.
Or quadriplegic. Quadriplegic and tetraplegic can be used interchangeably. But my dad has a injury in his spine quite high up, and that affects the movement from his neck down. So because of that, he has the tetraplegic definition.
Got it. Well, and you said you have a mental health disability. Tell me about that, if you would.
Yeah, so I have pretty severe anxiety and OCD, a couple other things going on, but I'm really grateful that I have a good support system, and I receive good medication for that. And I'm really open about it because I think quite a few people actually have hidden disabilities, and the more you talk about it, the more people feel comfortable opening up about that. And it's just really important to me to create spaces where people feel welcome and included and accepted. And having a mental health disability is quite a silent battle sometimes. So I try to be open about it and welcoming, and make sure that people don't have to face barriers or discrimination because of that.
Well, I can appreciate that, but doesn't chocolate help everything?
Absolutely.
Just checking.
Yeah. Dark chocolate, of course. Yeah.
My wife was more of a milk chocolate fan. I'm more flexible. Of course, we both also liked white chocolate, which is, you can't complain about that either, but chocolate is always good.
Especially that peppermint bark chocolate you get at the holidays.
There we go. Yeah, now we're talking. And they tend to only do that at Christmas time. So we have a Costco near here. And I, at Christmas, went in and bought several boxes of the Kirkland peppermint bark and one Ghirardelli. And so far, since we bought them near the beginning of December, I've gone through one box. They will last most of the year. It's sort of like Girl Scout cookies, Thin Mints, you know. They have to be parsed out just to play safe.
Although admittedly, I buy a lot of them, so they can be parsed out. Got to stock up in advance, you know?
Yeah, I usually buy at least a case of Thin Mints at a time.
Absolutely. That's the way to do it.
It is. So when you went to school, did you know at that time you had a disability of some sort, or how did all that work out?
I sort of had an inkling since I was young, but during my undergraduate years is when I officially got diagnosed with my disabilities. And I think it was really just, I was working a bunch of jobs, I was full-time studying, and everything was kind of like, I could almost coast by without trying to bring too much attention to my disability beforehand. But then eventually I realized I can't do this. I need to talk to someone, and finally being able to get the proper help I needed really made such an impact in my life, and being able to get on the right medication. And it actually helped inspire me to start some protocols through my undergraduate school, where I came into different classes and taught about accessibility resources, and I helped people go to get the proper counseling they needed, and teach them about all the options that were there for them that they might not know about, which I didn't know about at the beginning. And it was really fulfilling, actually, to see people get the help they need and then just shine from that.
How did your parents react to all that?
Oh, I mean, my family's my family's a very disability positive community. So, I mean, my dad with his physical health disability, and then I have other family members with disabilities as well. So they're very supportive, and I'm very honestly lucky to have them. And my dad introduced me to the disability community from a young age. So I felt very welcomed, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about disability communities is they're always so focused on inclusion and equity, and it's such a great place to be, and people are just so awesome.
Why did you decide, though, that you wanted to take on the role of being an advocate and really pushing for change rather than just saying, all right, so I'm a person with a disability, I'm going to go off and do my own thing, but I don't need to be an advocate?
I think it was a healthy dose of frustration with the way planning and communities are organized today. Especially going around town with family members and myself, we would always face barriers to access and transportation, especially public transportation systems. We would go, I live on the Pacific Northwest, which experiences a lot of climate change related hazards like floods, and a lot of California does too. And I believe you're in California now, so this is something you would probably resonate with, fires and all of that. And people with disabilities, their needs aren't really accounted for in planning evacuations and planning areas to be more resilient. So people with disabilities often get left behind, especially in flooding events. A good organization called Rooted in Rights did a documentary on Hurricane Katrina and the people with disabilities who are left behind in that. And I just realized that these barriers don't have to be there. They're put there through systemic and institutional barriers that were in place by poor planning and poor policy practices that have evolved over time to exclude people. But if we just go back and start mitigating some of those barriers, everyone will have the ability to be included and cared for and welcome in society.
So where did you go to college?
Well, I did my undergraduate at Simon Fraser University. It's out west in BC. On a mountain, actually. There's bears, which I like to tell people is a fun fact. And right now I'm just completing my master's degree in urban planning at the University of Toronto. And here I do a lot of work on disability rights and incorporating their needs into planning.
What was your undergraduate major?
It was in, so biogeophysical science is the technical name, but under the field of physical geography. And that was the reason I was so interested in those climate hazards I was bringing up earlier. Right. And I was understanding the processes behind why they happen. And then through my work with the Disability Foundation, where I was working on more of a community-based level in accessibility planning to incorporate the needs of people with disabilities into planning in the community, I realized there's not really, sure, we talk about climate change, and I'm reading all these climate change policies, I'm reading all these environmental policies, I'm reading about how to plan resilient communities, and the needs of people with disabilities aren't being thought of at all, which is a huge issue, because if they're not even thought of, then how are we going to create resilient communities that include people with disabilities? So that's kind of where I was bridging that interest between environmental sustainability, but also community resiliency for people with disabilities. And through my work, I kind of picked up transportation as well, but particularly public transportation as a sustainable way of moving across cities and connecting people to spaces and places, and incorporating the needs of people with disabilities into that as well.
Well, delving into that a little bit, why do you think it is that people tend to just not pay attention or leave people with disabilities behind?
Yeah, so I guess not pay attention, I feel that might not be I wouldn't say I necessarily think that, but I think there's just, if you don't have a disability or you don't know somebody who has a disability, you don't experience it on a day-to-day basis, or you have any reason to even think about it. It's not that they don't care, it's just, it's not something they personally experience, so they might not notice the nuances of needs that people with disabilities have, and then it gets overlooked. And a lot of planning in North America was very colonial, segregated, ableist, and a lot of the policies we have in place are from that period in time where people with disabilities were and still are an afterthought, although it's getting better. And I think a lot of it comes down to education. I was talking to, I won't name names, but I was talking to a CEO of a housing development company here in Toronto. And we were talking about building affordable housing in the community. And he was buying up land parcels to do this. And he genuinely thought all you needed to create accessible housing was adding a ramp on the floor. And that was it. There was nothing that needed to be done inside. There's no other barriers that needed to be considered. And he genuinely thought that. And I was honestly shocked. Like, this is the CEO of an affordable housing company. It's quite a large company, actually, in Toronto. And I just couldn't believe the lack of knowledge there. But on the bright side, he was very willing to learn, and he was very receptive to my feedback. And he incorporated some of my insights into his analysis, which was awesome. So I think it really shows that it's not that people don't care. It's just that they might not be aware of the barriers that are there. So it's important to learn what they are so you can mitigate them.
The other part about it is that when you're building a house from the ground up, pretty much to deal with physical issues as a starting point doesn't really cost a lot, unless you're going to a 2-story or 3-story house where you have to have the extra cost of an elevator. But to build in wider doors, to build in lower counters, to not have steps, and make the whole grounds accessible really doesn't cost, because you build it into the design. We've built several homes, and the reality is the only time we ever really had an extra cost, well, we had two. One, the first home that we designed was a manufactured home, and we worked with the home manufacturer, and it cost us $500 because they had to go get a different HUD design approved. And so $500 in the scheme of things. The other one was in New Jersey, where we had a home that had to be a 2-story home. So we did have to put an elevator in. But other than the elevator, there were no additional costs when you do it up front.
Absolutely.
And it is such a huge thing if you have to go back and do it after the fact.
Exactly. And there's so many cost analyses that show that it costs, like exactly like you're saying, the same price, sometimes cheaper, sometimes a tiny bit more, but plus or minus a few dollars here and there. Overall, it's a very similar cost. And also, it opens up the market to a whole new population too. I mean, 24% of people in Ontario identify as people as a person with a disability. So having accessibility in housing only increases the places where people can live. So.
Sure. And the problem is, of course, with all the homes that are already built, you run into all the difficulties of having to go back and do it later. But that's why it's important with new homes, affordable and otherwise, that accessibility be built into the process, because in reality, it's not just going to help people who happen to have some sort of physical disability, and we can look at other things as well, but it's also an aging population who are going to have to take advantage of those things.
Exactly. And it helps make a more equitable and inclusive communities too. And at least in Ontario, the government subsidizes companies that retrofit buildings to make them accessible. I'm not sure about the legislation in California, but there is places. Yeah, no, they don't. Okay, that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. Hopefully one day then. You do have ADA, so that's good.
Well, yeah, but there are other things about the ADA. For example, unless you're doing a major remodel, you don't have to go back and put in anything to necessarily make something accessible. And you're not going to get funding to do that, at least the way the structure is set up right now. So those do tend to be issues that we have to contend with. And again, that's why it's important up front that when you're building new housing, that you really put in all the stuff to make the home, the unit, accessible and usable by everyone.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
How do we change the conversation? Because there's another part to the conversation. Let's take it away from housing and urban planning and take it to the job market, where you go into a company and let's take blindness, because in a sense, it should be simpler to deal with. So we'll just use that for the moment. Okay. Somebody applies for a job and they need to have a screen reader to be able to hear what's going on the computer, or They need to have Braille signs on restrooms that aren't necessarily there already. And the people who are running the company, or you got a coffee machine that's touch screen, and how do you make that usable? But the people who run the company go, well, I can't afford to pay money to make any of those things accommodating to you. We just don't have the money to do that. And how do we change that conversation when in reality, it ought to be part of the cost of doing business to be inclusive for all?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I'm not sure about California, but that is outright discrimination here in Ontario.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. Okay. So same idea. And one of the interesting things, at least through my experience, because I've dealt with this, especially even your screen reader example. This past summer, I was working with the Ministry of Transportation, and all the onboarding documents for new hires were not screen reader compatible for some reason. So I would go in and make them all screen reader compatible. And they had no concern with this. But one of the things that helped the Ministry of Transportation, at least, was having a separate branch specifically focused for accessibility. And I think that's a really good idea. And I'm on the advisory committee for accessible transit at the Transportation Commission for Toronto, and a bunch of different initiatives in the city, at least, where there's accessibility committees, and having people who have disabilities or have experience working with disabilities come in and provide their expertise, I think, is so key. And can really help solve some of these problems. So if somebody went to a company, was in a company and said, I need Braille signage, and the company was saying no, that's when I would take it a step further. Ideally, they would have some sort of accessibility committee they could reach out to, which I know many places in Canada have. I'm not sure how it works in the United States, but many jurisdictions and municipalities in Canada have accessibility committees or boards who deal with these types of concerns and can help them get further legal aid and advice for this discrimination, but also just bringing it up ahead of time and saying, hey, actually, I'm not sure if you knew, but this here, if you could put Braille here, help me understand this. I've had a lot of conversations like that with people in planning, and just by explaining to them, a lot of times, I'd say 9 times out of 10, they make the change right away, because they're just not aware. Like there's a lack of awareness of these barriers that people face, really.
Well, there are a lot of lacks of awareness, but let's take another example: websites. You go to a company that's got a website and people need to interact with it. The company goes off and gets an estimate. Oh, it's going to cost $10,000, $20,000 to get a programmer or programmers hired to come and make that website accessible and inclusive. How do you deal with that?
Well, in that case, I would first you explain the benefits, right? Like what I mentioned earlier, there's a quarter of Ontarians have some sort of disability. It might not be a blindness, it might not be the need for a screen reader, but there are some sort of disability. Numbers fluctuate depending on the region. Globally, it's about 15% of people have disabilities. So if by making your website compatible for screen readers, you're really opening up a whole new audience to seeing whatever your product is or whatever your company is selling or what they do. And that's only beneficial because you're widening the scope of people who can interact with and be a part of your company. But aside from them saying no, again, that is a human rights issue. We have an act in Ontario called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act that actually requires these types of websites to be accessible for people with disabilities by 2025. It was put in place in 2005, the act. So a lot of companies now are hiring people to update these websites, and our provincial government does have some subsidies to do this as well. So pointing the attention to the subsidies that are available would be useful also.
Mm-hmm. A lot of places don't tend to have the subsidies, and I'm sure that even the subsidies are limited. And depending on the website, it can be a pretty complex website. And so companies hiccup at spending $20,000 or $30,000 or whatever the case happens to be to go in and make the website accessible for what they view as a small number of people. It doesn't change the fact of what you said, but it still is an issue for them because they're going, I can't afford to pay that money.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we get around that kind of situation? Because it is something that we are all confronted by. I mean, look at it this way. We know that about 98% of all websites aren't accessible and usable. And yes, a lot of that has to do with education. A lot of it has to do with the fact that people need to be made more aware of the value of doing it. They need to be made aware of the fact that in reality, there are studies that show that if you make your website inclusive and people come and use your website, they're going to come back time and time again because It's going to be hard to go elsewhere. But most businesses are not large and can't afford to hire a programmer. So how do they do that? And some of them build up pretty strong resistance to going off and making that change because I just can't afford to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's where subsidies are come into play here, and that's something that I'm really grateful that we have in Ontario, so they can help these small businesses that have those financial barriers. Again, I do find it hard to have. I feel like it's a human rights issue. So it's
it is a human rights issue.
So to me, it's just something that needs to be done. And saying it costs money isn't a really valid excuse to discriminate against people. And I'm sure you concur.
That is of course your view. However, not the view of the person who has to spend the money.
Yeah, and
I agree with you. But that is the issue. Yeah.
And I think that's why having it in legislation and policy is key. And that's something I'm working towards doing, because then you can say, well, it's required and this is discrimination at the end of the day. And if they're going to be uncooperative, at least you can have the legislation to back you in that.
Yeah, it's a long process to sometimes enact some of those things, which is difficult. I can't resist bringing up the fact that I work for a company called Accessibility, and I don't know whether you've looked at them.
I have, yes.
And so part of the answer can be, hey, if it only costs you $500 to make your website inclusive because you have under 1,000 pages, and a lot of the accessibility issues can be addressed by something like Accessibility, why not do that? But the answer ultimately really is it's education, and it's getting people to understand what you said. That is, you're going to lose about 25% of your business if you don't deal with making access happen, because people will go off and look for other websites that are more inclusive. And the fact is that if you do the job and you make the website available and you demonstrate and using it with the other parts of the company, like I said, Braille signage, which is not overly complicated, but other kinds of things like accessible coffee machines, since we tend to have coffee machines in our companies now for employees, and finding ways to make all those things work. If you make that step happen where you create that kind of inclusion, you will find that you have more loyal employees who are going to stick with you and not jump ship nearly as fast as other people.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's really important to drive home to people who are more money-minded about it, who maybe care less about the human rights aspect and more about the dollars. Because at the end of the day, like you said, you are increasing access to your website, and you will have those loyal customers now who can navigate your website properly and who trust the website.
What kind of resistances do you see and so far as dealing with accessibility, whether it's in companies or homes or whatever? What kind of really strong resistance do you tend to see on a regular basis?
I say on a regular basis, I don't know if there's one particular thing. I have a lot of I come up to face the Heritage Planning Act a lot, because this act, I kid you not, will value the character of a building. So like whatever gives it its heritage value over the right to access a building for people with disabilities. And I think the Heritage Act is something that I find conflicts with disability rights the most. And the Heritage Act is just it's kind of as it sounds. It's about preserving buildings because of their inherent heritage value. Maybe it's a 40-year-old building or a 50-year-old building. They don't have to be that old. But these buildings were kind of made in a time where accessibility really was an afterthought. And they're not generally that accessible to people with disabilities. And there's been cases in Toronto and elsewhere where people have bought homes, their own home. It was not a heritage building, and then a disgruntled neighbor found out they were going to renovate it, or a few disgruntled neighbors found out they were going to renovate it, and then they moved to give the building heritage status, and thus prevented them from performing the alterations. However, recently there's been a lot of outcry and a lot of coverage on the media and the news because of this. So there's a lot of these decisions have been reversed, and people are able to then do the accessibility modifications they need. However, it's just such a clear sign that there's so much work that needs to be done still, and how frustrating for people who just wanted to renovate their home to have to go through all of this just to be able to say, no, I need to access this home. But public spaces as well too. There's some legislative buildings in Ontario where we had to fight to put in a ramp because they're worried it would, infringe on the character of the building. Although more recently, I have noticed a trend, definitely, that people are siding with the accessibility side of things over the heritage side of things. And I am seeing a general trend towards less of these cases happening. So that's something I'm pleased about. But also, even when we're talking about just general, so like in my role on the advisory committee for accessible transit at the Toronto Transit Commission, we do a lot of on-site audits, in-person audits of things. And before we do these audits, we'll go through the designs with whoever's implementing a transit line. We'll talk about all the possibilities and how to make it accessible. And it's a very long process. And finally, when it starts being implemented, we go on site and do these audits. And sometimes it's just not how it's, for example, recently I was looking at an LRT station, which is a light rail station for public transit. And two people who were on the audit with me were blind. And the tactile edging, which for listeners who may not be familiar with this, it's bumps on the ground that indicate whether you're going to go onto a busy road, or there's going to be a grade change, or there might be hazardous materials coming up. They were flush with the ground, so they were not detectable by the two people's walking canes, and they just walked right onto the road. And that's just an example of some of the nuances that you capture on in-person audits that you don't really, you would think in theory that it's accessible. There's the tactile edging there. I mean, among a bunch of other things they did, not just tactile edging, but it actually wasn't. So really being in there on person helps clarify things too. And that's somewhere where I face some issues sometimes too. I mean, you can't make a place 100% accessible. That's not the point. It's about creating a place that's as accessible and as inclusive as possible. So yeah, definitely lots of little nuances and little struggles along the way, but that's, the part of what it is to fight for disability rights and disability justice. And I'm happy to do it.
Well, the other side of truncated domes or tactile edges is people in wheelchairs hate them because it bounces them around like cobblestones. My wife hated them, and I understand that. Also, from my perspective, as a blind person using a cane and or using a guide dog, the surfaces aren't all that wide, and if you're walking at any kind of speed, you could go right over it and totally miss them.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the reality is, I still think it comes back down to people doing a better job of using a cane to know where they are. But I appreciate, especially Sacramento, California is a great place for this, where a lot of curbs are not curbs at the intersections, at the corners. They go flush right down to the street. And yeah, they are very difficult to tell. You can, if you're really paying attention, because the sidewalk is composed of different material than the street. Right. If you happen to use a cane, where you can notice that. But at the same time, it is an issue that needs to be addressed. And I don't know what the ultimate solution to that happens to be or really should be, but I'm not sure that the tactile or truncated domes really are the ultimate solution, because if they're only like 18 inches and you take a step that's more than 18 inches, you could go right over them. And
Absolutely.
It's a problem. So I think it's something else that has to be looked at. But you bring up an interesting point with the heritage homes thing. When we moved to New Jersey in 1996, they were just preparing to modify the train station where we lived in Westfield, New Jersey. The way you got on the train before that was there are steps built into the side of the train car, and you went up these like 18-inch steps, and you went up 3 of them, and you were in the car. Well, everyone started to recognize with the Americans with Disabilities Act, you've got to have a sidewalk that's raised so that people can go right across, which is fine, except people in the town started to protest and yell saying, we don't want that because that means we've got to go back or around and go up a ramp or up steps. And if we're running to catch a train, we might miss it because we'll miss being able to go up those steps. We got to take this slightly longer route. And we don't want that. Why don't they just hire people to be there to lift at every train station to lift people in wheelchairs on trains, which was ridiculous.
That's crazy.
And it was a major fight. So the problem is there's a lack of awareness, but there's also a lack of sensitivity and a lack of understanding that you can say these things and you can say how inconvenient it is. Well, why don't you just plan on getting to the train 15 seconds earlier or 30 seconds earlier? And it means that more people can ride the train. And the reality is they finally, New Jersey Transit pushed it through and got it all addressed. And I never heard of anybody having a problem getting on the train. So,
of course, not. Yeah,
that's the other side of it. My favorite example, though, of all this is look at a place like in Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg. And Williamsburg is the original capital of Virginia. It goes back to the 1700s, Revolutionary War. And they did not want to change buildings in Williamsburg, like the governor's house or the state house, to put ramps in because it would have destroyed the integrity of the building from a standpoint of what it looked like and so on.
Right.
And I appreciate that. So we were there once, my wife and I, and we said we wanted to go up into the state house, but it was up several steps. How do we get in? Well, it was a manual chair. I could have tipped her back, but we were talking about it, and this guy comes up who was a guard.
Okay.
And he said, "Oh, let me show you." He said, "Stay right here." There was a little flagstone patio right in front of the steps going up into the building. He said, "So just stay here." He walks away. We're standing on the flagstone path or patio.
Oh my gosh.
Suddenly the patio raises up and slides across.
He didn't even tell you. Okay, that would be startling.
Well, the point was that they had created a way to get people into the building that in no way interfered with the integrity of the historic value of the building. It was really cool.
Yeah, and I think that's a really cool example of ways that you can. There's no excuse not to have accessibility in heritage buildings. There's always a way to make it happen.
We couldn't get to upper floors. There was no easy way to do that. And we had a discussion with him and some other people about that. And they said, we are constantly trying to figure out a way without destroying the building to figure out how to get to upper levels. And they'll figure it out one of these days, but they hadn't by the last time we were there.
I'm sure they will. Yeah. And another thing is they allow modern day plumbing in all of these buildings, which involves removing some of the elements of buildings and maybe quote unquote compromising the character or the heritage of the building to put in plumbing. So I don't really see if they're using that to justify plumbing, then how come they won't be able to put in accessibility modifications? To me, it's also a necessity, right?
I'm not sure that they did any of that at the buildings in Colonial Williamsburg.
Yeah, that sounds like a different case.
That's an unusual case, but I think for what you're talking about, absolutely in general, that's perfectly true.
Exactly, yeah.
But Williamsburg was a little bit of an exception, and understandably so. But even so, they worked to make it possible to get into the buildings and do things. And the restaurants were accessible and other things. They had created ways to get in. So it was a lot of fun to go there and see the creativity. Yeah, it is a problem because the attitude isn't just a lack of education. There is true resistance to change and true resistance to inclusion. And it is something that we do need to deal with.
Exactly. And like I mean, you've said and I've said, education definitely helps people who have that resistance to change, because a lot of times it comes from um, a lack of understanding and compassion for what other people are going through and experience, and then when they can be told or described to or given examples of how this adjustment will help people and how people are prevented from seeing things currently or going places currently, and how a small modification will make a big difference in people's lives, generally people come around. It's a longer process than I would like, but it's definitely possible, and it happens.
Well, I mentioned New Jersey Transit. Tell me a little bit about accessibility when it comes to public transportation and so on, and some of the challenges or things that you've seen, and how are we moving toward getting that to be addressed in a lot of different ways?
Well, I guess if I take a step back, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this, it's similar across North America. Systemic and institutional ableism, which is the discrimination towards people with disabilities, exists within almost all public transportation systems in North America today. I presume many other regions of the world as well, but I'm not well versed in other areas. And what I mean by that is public transportation has historically been designed and constructed in a way that has created unnecessary barriers for people with disabilities, like we mentioned, and it's therefore excluded people with disabilities from their right to access space in the community. And public transportation is key. It gets people from space to space. It helps people get to work. It helps people get to appointments, to see friends. And I should note that this access is not just pertaining to the disability community. This access issue also pertains to racialized communities, low-income communities, and other vulnerable communities as well, just to point out. And it can be traced back to these poor planning practices I was talking about, where there's segregation and exclusion of the quote unquote other. And I guess a good example of this that North Americans might be familiar with is redlining. And it's these practices where they were quite racist practices where they separated white communities and Black communities. And there's a lot of ableism involved in practices like this as well, although it's more nuanced and less talked about. Anyways, so what I do today works towards removing these systemic and institutional barriers that have kind of worked their way into all facets of public transportation in North America. But I focus on a Canadian context. And recently, I was working with the Ministry of Transportation, where I worked to create accessible rail for people. I've also worked in operations planning and service design with Metrolinx to look at ridership with the pandemic and people with disabilities, and communicate that with external stakeholders. And my work right now, which I'm so proud of on that advisory committee, which I've mentioned for accessible transit, really allows us to help. We also retrofit old stations to make them accessible and plan new stations to make them accessible for people with disabilities. And I feel like it's this role where I can really make a difference in the community. It's really fulfilling to be able to be like, this station didn't used to be accessible, but now it is. And now more people can have access to places they need to go. You know what I mean?
So what kinds of things do you do to get a station to be accessible?
Oh, it's well, first of all, I guess if it's an old station and we're retrofitting it, so if we're like reconstructing it to make it accessible, we do some site visits of the old station. We talk with designers of the station. We talk with project managers. We see what could be done. I'm not an engineer, so what can be constructed? There's so many discussions that happen. A lot of the stations that are older are way too narrow and don't have elevator access, and don't have any indication where the drop-off is. I know you're not a fan of tactile, or maybe not a fan, it's too strong, but it's something we use a lot here. And there's mixed. My dad's in a wheelchair too, and they are
used here too.
Yeah, and he has to pop a wheelie over those tactile edging. So I definitely know what you mean. But it's definitely something that helps, especially in subway stations, in my opinion, because we just have those like abrupt drop offs. So having much wider indications that a drop off is coming is useful. Although by all means not the only or the best way to do so, but it is affordable on a tight budget and semi decent. But anyway,
if a person is using their cane and they have a long cane, and the accepted practice, although not among some professionals in the field, is you should have a cane that comes up under your chin so you have about a 3-step warning. And even without the tactile bumps, you would be able to have enough of a warning of a drop off to be able to deal with it. But I'm not, we're not going to debate that. It's they're around. But tell me other kinds of things that you would do to make a station accessible, safe for a person who's blind.
Yeah. So one of the things we do, for example, if we're talking about people who are blind or not necessarily blind, but other disabilities as well, like mobility related disabilities. There's a big issue with coupler gaps, which are that space between two carts on a subway. So you know how each car kind of connects and there's like a big gap there. People kept falling into them or confusing them for entranceways, which makes sense because the way they're shaped kind of give off the impression that you could walk into there, but it's actually in between, it's onto the tracks. So we designed these little flap things that come up and prevent people from doing that. So there's small little additions. That's just something I worked on recently, which is why I brought it up. And it's something that was useful to the blind community, just because we were looking at cases of people walking into the tracks, or even people tripping and falling, or you're getting pushed and you're all rushing for the door. And then another thing I was looking at was we had some bollards up because, like you mentioned about the tactile edging, you said people should notice it, but people weren't noticing it enough. So we had to put up these bollards.
And that's definitely an issue.
Yeah. And there was this concern about if there was an emergency and only some doors could open, at least with the trains we're working with, or the subway station cars we're working with, there's only one of the doors is truly fully accessible out of about 5, so 1 per cart, which is again another issue, but that's the way it is for now. And there was concern that, what if it stops in an emergency and this accessible door is half covered by these bollards? So then we made them bendable and flexible, and we got out there a few of my friends who use wheelchairs who were trying to wheel over them, and it was too big, so they had to redesign them to make them thinner, and then we were concerned about potentially guide dogs not knowing whether to go over it. There was just someone who was with me who had a guide dog who raised that concern, and then eventually it's a lot of trial and error, and you come and you find these solutions. So we ended up doing the flexible ones, not the non-flexible ones, and they are a little thinner and they have warning signs, and I guess we'll see if that helps people more than the tactile etching. But yeah, and again, we're going to have to review that and then try something new if it doesn't work. A lot of it is trial and error, and a lot of it's nuanced because everyone has unique disabilities and everyone has unique needs because of their unique disabilities. So that's why more voices is important, bringing more opinions to the table.
Well, so here's another question.
Yeah.
To do it this way, where is the responsibility of the consumer in all this? For example, I submit, having been using guide dogs since I was 14 and been mobile my whole life and using a cane for most of my life, where is my responsibility in being able to deal with some of those things? Like you mentioned, the subway car space between the cars, the connectors and so on. If I'm using a cane properly, I would detect that we're not dealing with an entrance to a car because I would feel the drop off rather than the cane finding that there's a car there to step into. And likewise, again, dealing with the drop offs, if there weren't tactile edgings, my cane will find it far enough in advance to allow me to stop or alter my course. So where is my responsibility as a consumer in all of that?
I think the same can be said for people who do not have disabilities. Is if everyone used everything in a best case way, then we'd have a lot less safety measures in place because it wouldn't be necessary. And that doesn't just apply to people with disabilities. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And things happen. And like I said, people get pushed when it's busy in almost all subway stations, not just the ones here in Toronto. And people get pushed into these spaces when there's rush.
Right.
And there's certain instances that can't be avoided. So it's about maximizing the safety possible. And in this case, oh, sorry, yes?
Which is not to say consumers don't have a responsibility, but by the same tokens, what it is saying is that consumers should use all of their tools, but at the same time, you can't rely on that.
Exactly. And like like I said, in the emergency situation, evacuation is an issue too. And that's not necessarily the consumer, but that's definitely not the consumer's responsibility. They just need to get out because there was an emergency they didn't expect and something happened. And yes, everyone should be trying to be as safe as possible in transit systems, whether you have a disability or not. But in reality, things happen, people are distracted, it's busy, people are confused, they might be new to the area, not familiar, it might be their first time on transit. So there's a lot of circumstances that come into play. So which
brings up another question, again, dealing with blindness. What you haven't discussed is information access. So for example, I go into a station.
Yes.
How do I know what train is coming?
Yeah, so we do,
you know, those kinds of things. And I'm not saying you don't in any way, but I'm curious, what do you do to retrofit stations to deal with those kinds of things?
We actually do quite a bit in that way. And one of the main issues with the new station I audited last month was the air conditioning was too loud for anybody to hear the instructions. And it was really funny, actually, because I don't know if people who aren't from Canada might not know, and I'm not sure the conversion to Fahrenheit, but it gets to 40 degrees Celsius, which is extremely hot in the summer.
Yes.
Yeah. And people think of it as it gets cold here too. Don't get me wrong. It is cold right now. I wish I was in California right now, but I'm here, unfortunately, in cold winter, but it gets really hot.
This morning it got down to -5 Celsius here.
Oh, that's pretty chilly.
Yeah.
For California.
I live up on what's called the high desert. So we have mountains around us, and I'm about 2,850 feet up. So we had a little bit chill, and it hasn't gotten all that warm yet today. But anyway.
It's better than here. I'd take that over the weather here.
Oh, I know. I hear you.
But yeah, definitely still cold. I'm surprised. I guess when I think of California, I think of like LA and the warm beaches, which is so naive, I suppose.
But just keep in mind, when you're at one of those warm beaches during the winter, you can drive 2 hours and be up in snow country and go ski.
Wow. Yeah. I'd love to visit in the winter sometime. It'd be so nice. But yes, back to audible indicators. The air conditioning, which has to be on in the summer, was way too loud, and people couldn't hear people couldn't hear the voice telling you where you were, what station you were at, or how far you had to go, and that was a huge issue, of course. So we're working on fixing that, and this was a new station, and it was just embarrassing, because not for the designers, because they worked so hard to make sure that they had all these proper sounds in place and signals in place and audible signals in place, and then the air conditioning, of all things, was too loud and people couldn't hear it. But they are working to fix that, and we do have that in place. We do have braille signs we put places. They needs to be more in the older stations, which is something we're working on in retrofitting old stations. We also have a program, at least here, and I know it's very similar in other areas as well, where people who are new to transit for free can sign up for a program where someone accompanies them for the first few times to make sure that they're familiar with their route and know where to go, and that's free of cost. And I think it's really beneficial to people, especially people who have invisible disabilities, especially even like anxiety, or they might have autism or something. Those are some major clients who use that service, that free service, and I think that's helpful too. And having attendants there to help is really important too. But of course, there's so much work that needs to be done. And like I said, I just pointed out a big issue that we found last month. So it's definitely never ending.
What's happening in terms of using some of the newer technologies, working toward having the ability to use indoor navigation apps and things like that? Is anything being done in Canada with that, in so far as all that goes in that regard?
Yes, but it is kind of in its infancy here. There's a lot of talk, and there's some meetings about how we can do that and what would be involved and how we can make sure it's accessible for people. I recently did an audit. My thesis is in incorporating accessibility into flood resilient infrastructure in Toronto. And I was doing an audit of a green corridor, which is a a trail, basically a pathway with shrubbery and trees and grass and parks and all of that. Think a green space in an urban area, kind of, but a long linear path. Anyways, I digress. And this is where I sparked the conversation about having this technology and how it'd be so useful for people, because the GPS doesn't really extend onto these trails, and it would be very, very useful for people. I was walking with someone who was blind, and they said it would really help them. And then QR codes are being added to a lot of things here. That's something that's being done, and it continues to be done, but needs to still be done more. So those are a couple things.
There's a lot of work being done, though, on indoor navigation that
it's interesting.
Might really be helpful. I'd love to talk with you about that offline and maybe help you make some contacts that would help with that. But there are actually solutions that can help in moving around indoor spaces, and it can be outdoor spaces as well, that are not nearly as complex to make happen as you might think. There's a lot of development going into all of that. The other service for blind people that immediately comes to mind as a service you may or may not be familiar with, called IRA. Are you familiar with IRA?
Yes, I'm familiar with IRA. Yes. AIRA.
And the reality is that it is a service that one has to pay for. But if the government would make stations, for example, or Pole Cities, IRA access locations, then there's an immediate access by any person who needs more visual information to be able to get access to that stuff.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I would love to continue this conversation with you offline too, because I know you're very well versed in this area, and your insights would be so meaningful.
Well, we could certainly talk about that, and would love to. Tell me more about your thesis and the things that are going on with it.
Yeah, so it's all I can think about right now, actually, because
I'll bet it is.
I'm excited to be graduate. I'll be finishing in March, so it's coming up. I'm not done my thesis. I'm almost there. But yeah, so I'll be presenting it in March, and basically I'm looking at green corridors, which I said are these interlinked green spaces, often with pathways, typically in urban areas. And they are really important because they reduce urban flooding, increase biodiversity, act as carbon sinks, so they take carbon out of the atmosphere. They reduce flooding, and they increase social and physical health and well-being. So they help humans as well. And it's just super interesting to me because it combines my passion for environmental sustainability and disability justice, and also active transportation, because moving through these corridors is a form of active transportation. And what I'm doing is, and I'm sure you can tell, I'm a big fan of in-person audits, because they just capture things that can't be captured online or in a discussion, even though those are valuable too. But I'm doing in-person audits of these green corridors in Toronto with people with disabilities. I'm lucky I got some funding for it, so I'm able to hire people with disabilities to do these audits with me. And so far I've received such valuable insight and feedback. And you know, I think I've done 9 or 10 audits so far. I'm aiming for a few more. And the interesting thing is, like you said, with housing, like, it's very small, okay, maybe not small, but the cost would be very similar to doing it to increase accessibility in these spaces. And a lot of things we find in terms of barriers is like I mentioned, a lack of QR codes on signage, a lack of Braille on signage, a lack of lighting, which might be a little more expensive, but not crazy in terms of these projects. And then certain things like, there's 100 garden beds free to the public, but none of them are raised. So people with wheelchairs can't go under and tend to them if they want to. And there are a lot of things. Some of the crosswalks don't have any audible indicator when the light changes. So they're relatively small things to change, which is actually really nice, because because I'm working with municipalities and not municipalities, with project planners and people who are organizing these green corridors and designing these green corridors to discuss what can be changed and how they can make it more accessible. And it's a lot better to pitch more affordable things to companies because they're a lot more on board with them when it's a low cost barrier, especially when they're on tight budgets. A lot of these are city projects that don't have huge budgets, so having these small barrier adjustments can make such a big difference in people's lives and create such an equitable and inclusive space. And the thing is, with environmental planning, it's at least from a sustainability point of view, and less so in general, it's relatively new in the planning realm and is gaining a lot of traction. And the issue we're seeing here is very similar to what I was talking about with transportation, is all these what we're trying to fix in transportation. And it's all these segregation and exclusionary approaches are kind of being reintroduced in environmental planning. These green spaces are being put in affluent communities. They're being put in predominantly white communities. They're being implemented without considering the needs of vulnerable people, like people with disabilities, or not to say that people with disabilities are vulnerable, but systemically they face barriers that they shouldn't have to. And in that sense, it creates vulnerabilities that they shouldn't have to face. And cultural barriers as well. And so what's really cool is that this research, it aims to stop this cyclic exclusionary planning approach and aims to reimagine these spaces to create a more equitable place where people can enjoy it, and it aims to stop this cycle of exclusion of different groups. So it's really cool and it's really fulfilling. And I think because it's kind of a new area of planning, there's a lot of potential for it to be done in a just way. So it's nice to be able to have, and I've had a lot of positive feedback with the project managers I've been talking to, and they're all very keen to listen and to create things in a more equitable manner. So I'm really fortunate in the sense that I've received positive feedback, and that I've had such great help from other people with disabilities in the community too.
Well, the things like audible traffic signals are, of course, pretty expensive. And
that would be, yes.
And need to be used somewhat judiciously. And not every street needs to have an audible traffic signal. And you pointed it out. All the audible signal does is tells you that the lights changed. It doesn't tell you that it's safe to go.
Exactly.
And I've seen way too many audible traffic signals in places where all you're doing is walking across a street. There's no complex intersection. There's just 4 curbs. And people still want to have audible traffic signals. And the fact of the matter is, it isn't going to make you more safe if you're listening for traffic. And again, there are those people who can't. So there are other issues there. But the reality is, when you've got a complex intersection or a roundabout, well, roundabouts are a little different. But when you've got several streets coming into an intersection, that gets to be more fun.
Yeah, I imagine so. And the person I was talking with was a blind person who did this audit with me. And for them, they found it really important. So for people who might be more skilled at listening to traffic, like you or other people, it might not be as much of a need. But for some people, they find it necessary. And I also, like I said, it doesn't necessarily tell you the direction, which is another interesting problem. It would be useful if it actually repeated or stated where to go. But it doesn't. But regardless, that would be something that would be less of a, I guess in terms of recommendations, there's nearer term recommendations, and then would be nice in the future recommendations, and that's would be nice in the future recommendations. And then smaller things like raised garden beds. All you have to do is build a bed that someone can wheel under. There's 100 beds. It's simple.
Right.
So there's quite a nuance there. And honestly, and I guess I did bring up a more expensive one, but there are quite a few budget ones.
But it's a valid one to talk about as well. So last question, because we're going to have to run, but tell me, what are you going to do once you get your master's degree thesis presented and you graduate? So what are you going to do after you go off and graduate? Or are you just going to go on and become a professional student and go get a PhD?
We'll see about that. Right now, I'm just in finished master's degree mode.
Yes, good for you.
And I'm very excited about it. And I'm so grateful that I've been able to have this opportunity, because it's really allowed me to help make the community more equitable, and it helped make places more inclusive for everyone, not just people with disabilities. And I've always found it fulfilling to create equitable and inclusive communities. And I'm extremely passionate about disability justice. And I know know that I'll be very happy in a role that allows me to create inclusive and barrier-free communities. I mean, I'm only 25 years old, so I'm very happy that I've had this opportunity to achieve all this progress in the disability community so far. And I really hope that I'm able to continue in accessibility planning or in a role that contributes towards bettering the community when I finish my degree. And that's kind of my goal, and that's where I see myself continuing.
Well, let me just tell you that once you get that degree and you're going out and doing stuff, we want to have you back and we want to hear about what's going on. You haven't escaped forever.
You're too sweet. Thank you so much.
But I want to thank you for being here. This has been fun. If people want to reach out to you or learn more about anything that you're doing, how can they do that?
I think my LinkedIn would be best. And I gave you that link,
and
I believe.
Why don't you go ahead and say what it is?
Yeah, so it's Lauren Foote, and now I have to
you have to spell
up the address. Oh yeah, I guess I could just spell my name. So it's Lauren Foote, like the body part, but an E on the end. So Foote. And then you should be able to find me on LinkedIn. I think I'm just looking it up there. Yeah, just Lauren Foote, and I have the ACAT thing in my heading, so that's probably all you need.
Yeah, we have some of that in the notes. And so I think what you have talked about is absolutely fascinating and fun. It is worth talking about. It is worth having a discussion about, and it's worth continuing the discussion to see how it goes and see any way that we can help in educating people. And I hope that people found this valuable today, because there's a lot that people do need to know, and they need to recognize that we are all part of society, and it's inexcusable that some of us get left out.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm so glad that I've had the opportunity to talk with you about this today, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, I'd love to hear from you listening out there. Please let us know what you think about all this. You can reach me as usual at michaelhi@accessibe.com. Or you can go to Michael Hingson, HINGSON.com/podcast. And we hope that you will, wherever you're listening to us, and especially when you go to some of the bigger podcast places like iTunes and so on, give us a 5-star rating. We appreciate your ratings and your reviews and your comments. And I know that Lauren will appreciate knowing about it as well.
Yes.
So please let us know. Please keep us posted. We love your thoughts. And Lauren, one more last time, thank you very much for being with us today.
And thank you so much. I had such a nice time chatting with you.